word poem. Thank you, Lamia. So it's a spoken word poem by Rami Kanazi. He's actually one of my favorite poets. I haven't seen him in a while, but during when I was in college, he used to do a lot of events. And as always, even though what I'm going to play is a couple years old, it's always very relevant. So you know what, let's just get started so that because I do see Lena and Sabi are here with us already. So tonight we have two people from Paralegal. So we're gonna play the video and then we will get started.
This divestment bill hurts my feelings. That Caterpillar bulldozer ended life in the body of an American citizen, drove her bones into the ground while a company cashed in on the sale. The claws of D9 bulldozers unearthed the livelihood of occupied Palestinians, uprooting their graveyards to make way for illegal settlements. But we need a positive campus climate. While HP stock rises on division, producing technology to segregate Palestinians, biometric IDs at checkpoints, enhancing the naval blockade of an open-air prison, Palestinians on campus listen to words like positive, climate, hurt feelings, knowing their tuition invests in companies raining terror on loved ones. That suffering, like their voices, is non-existent to student board members looking for cushy jobs at top 5 law firms. But this divestment bill, it's divisive. The Montgomery bus boycott, divisive. The Great Boycott, one-sided. Abolishing slavery, radical. Nelson Mandela, a terrorist. Indigenous, savages, women's suffrage, complicated. Desegregation, provocative. Hiroshima security, internment camps a necessity. Bantustan's autonomy, Iraq liberation, Palestine barren. There is always gonna be an excuse. Catchphrases, talking points, strip away names and faces. We are being militant, unreasonable. There's context to this oppression. The word apartheid, it makes you feel uncomfortable. It's apartheid by definition. Fits a 73 convention. By law, it is a crime against humanity. 2 sets of laws for 2 people. Labor, land ownership, access to education. 50 laws of discrimination, 46 years of occupation, 27,000 homes demolished, nearly 1 million arrested since '67. Whoa, every nation has problems, but why the singling out on campuses? You mean like Darfur? Tibet? South Africa? Sweatshops, Coca-Cola, animal testing, the Keystone Pipeline, undocumented rights, the prison industrial complex, fossil fuels, teacher unions, university cuts, and bottled water? The real question, why are you singling out any injustice for protection? Let me get the next one for you. Israel is democratic. Democratic like coal is clean, Miller Lite is the same great tasteless filling, and McDonald's salads are healthy. These are not imagined scenarios. Our tuition dollars are profiting off of death. Divestment is the next step. This is not about a nation or a people, but what's being done to people in our names, with our currency. This university will not liberate anyone, but it can choose to cease making a buck off of misery. Vote yes for divestment, no to appeasement. Affirming injustice isn't positive for any climate.
Oops, guys. Okay. Sorry guys. Okay, any comments or responses? I'm looking through the chat now. Rabia, I'm not calling you out, but I did say I saw you said this was a good one.
Yeah, it makes me think about the documentary from Netflix, The 14th, where they're talking about how they show videos of the civil rights movement and how at every single point, at any type of movement towards progress has been called too far, too much by the oppressors. And I think that he's just really highlighting how unradical it is to divest and how simple of an ask of universities. He even says it. He's like, we're not asking you to liberate. we're saying just like stop making a buck off of it. And it's just I think that's what's like is 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 both powerful and frustrating because it's we really ask for the least in 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 preserving life.
You can always call me out. I think this is also one of the ones where, as someone who used to work in higher ed and is still quite invested, when people tell me that, like folks in higher ed and students can't do anything, especially like in the past year, we've seen so much has started on student campuses and how in so many critical movements it has started from student campuses. This is one that like I will always be like, oh, let me like passive aggressively send this to people. And so that's why like my first reaction was like, oh, this is such a great one because it tells it so much better than I feel like my words ever can.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Rabia. Thanks, Halima. First, obviously, the messaging is so important. And again, it's like, why is this even still so problematic? These are all injustices we should all be speaking out against. And then two, Remy's done a few of these. They're really well done. And it's just aesthetically really well done. And definitely share. And yes, we are going to share these. Um, yes, Nida.
Hi guys. So when I saw this, it also reminded me how important it is that we know our history, and how little we know about it, you know. Uh, I think when we see and we can teach people, I mean, I don't know how much of a difference it makes for the people who have already made up their mind, but to show them that when Martin Luther King died, a majority of the population was not with him, even though it's obviously to us now it was the right answer, to have equality for all. That was not the popular thing. Just to wake people up and make them realize sometimes, because I think people don't realize how much in history, that these figures who were fighting for obviously true things and obviously just positions were seen as terrorists or radical. I think people forget that a lot.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and even now when we're talking about the genocide in Gaza, so many people say now, just wait a couple years or another decade or so, everyone will easily say this was wrong. But unfortunately, in the moment, that's not always agreed upon. That I do see your hand raised, but just for time's sake, we're gonna keep going. If you can drop any more comments in the chat. I do want to give the floor to Lena and Sabia who've joined us tonight. So today's class, it's week 7. I know it's hard to believe. Next week is our last class. Tonight's class is Standing Strong in the Face of Repression. Oops, sorry. So this is our little caterpillar. Oh, sorry, I didn't even fix that. And it's that's standing strong in the face of repression. So we have a presentation from the Palestine legal team. We're gonna have some time after if they're comfortable with questions. And then after whatever time we have left, we're gonna leave it for a little open discussion because we've been doing a lot of presentations just to see if anyone has any questions or check-ins. And we'll talk a little bit about Except for Palestine if we have time as well. So I'm really grateful for Lina and Sabia to be joining us tonight, especially. It's always a pleasure and appreciated to have you. Unfortunately, now more than ever, I think it's so important to have institutions like Legal, and I'm really we are really appreciative of all the work they're doing, and for them taking the time out tonight to join us, especially with what we've seen this week. If anyone knows, I'm sure they're going to talk about it. So first, I'm going to introduce Sabia. Ahmed Sabia is a staff attorney at Palestine Legal, providing legal support to Palestine activists and supporting the organization's legislative work by tracking and advocating against legislation targeting advocacy for Palestinian rights. Understanding that the law was primarily built to protect the powerful, Sabia has dedicated her lawyering to turning that balance upside down and to advancing the rights of those who have been pushed to the margins and silenced. Sabia is a New Yorker, born and raised with roots in Puerto Rico and Bangladesh. She is admitted to practice law in both New York and DC. And Lena is a Sorry, my little thing. Lina Asi is a Palestinian community organizer with the Palestinian Youth Movement. Since 2014, Lina has been organizing for the Palestine movement, both in Canada and the US. In 2014, she helped to pass a historic BDS resolution at McMaster University that mobilized over 600 students. Over the years, Lena's work has been focused on developing political education materials, conducting oral history narrative interviews of Palestinian community members, local grassroots community organizing, and mutual aid work servicing working class and refugee Arab communities. Lena earned her BA in Political Science and Labor Studies and an MA in Labor Studies at McMaster, and her dissertation is focused on the Palestinian labor movement in the post-Oslo era. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'm going to mute myself now so you guys can introduce yourselves as I switch over to your presentation.
Hi everyone, my name is Sabia. I'm really glad to be here with you all and looking forward to sharing some of the work that Legal has been doing, and the trends that we've been seeing of repression that I'm sure you all are familiar with as well. But we'll just be summarizing that for you all and trying to have a discussion too.
Hi everyone. My name is Lena. I'm the advocacy manager with Palestine Legal, and thankful for PAC for inviting us and excited to be in community with you all tonight.
Do you guys see it full screen now?
It's not full. I don't see it full screen.
Give me a second. Is it good?
Looks pretty good. Okay. I can start. Hi everyone. So Lena and I are here on behalf of Palestine Legal. Palestine Legal, for those of you who might not be familiar, is a legal organization, and our mission is to bolster the Palestine solidarity movement by challenging efforts that we see that threaten, harass, or try to legally bully activists for Palestine into silence and inaction. So the kinds of things that you might see us doing, we do litigation, we provide legal support to students facing various kinds of oppression from their university, like having to go through disciplinary proceedings. We also do different kinds of advocacy, and also do communications work as well. And so these are kind of some of the different things that we have done. We also done some legislative work, keeping up to date on some of the legislation that we've seen that have targeted the movement for Palestine, although we're doing a little bit less of that these days because of just the need that that is coming to us for all kinds of legal support in this time. But that's just some of what Legal does. We can go to the next slide. So the goals for today is we want to talk about what the trends of repression are, and also talk about the trends of resistance against that repression. We want to equip organizers with legal and advocacy strategies, and also resources so that we can continue to build the movement. And lastly, we also want to help boost your activism with information that we can provide, any resources that you think you might need that we might be able to give you, and also a collective reflection on the power that we all hold. Next slide. And also, just a disclaimer, we have to say that this presentation is not supposed to be legal advice. So this is just general information, summaries of different trends that we've seen, and the work that we do, but it's not legal advice. And this is a picture of the team. Not everyone though. See, I'm not there, so It's not everyone, but all right. Next slide, please. So these are just some of the examples of the work that we do. Intakes with different activists, whether those are student activists or, you know, off campus, or it might be faculty, just different people who have needs that come to us with their questions, or reporting incidents to us that have happened to them. We do work with Title VI, which is something we're going to talk a little less about today, but it's Title VI, for those of you who might not be familiar with it, is an anti-discrimination law here in the US. Its larger title is Title VI, is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Title VI belongs to that law, and it basically tries to prohibit discrimination. And we have made the argument at Pal Legal that anti-Palestinian racism or discrimination should be included within that. We also do resources and know your rights trainings. And as I mentioned, advocacy and communications are also part of what we do. So I'll hand it over to Lena now to talk more about what anti-Palestinian racism is.
Thanks, Sophia. Maybe we can go to the next slide, and I'm sure folks have heard about the term anti-Palestinian racism. Maybe by a show of hands, are folks familiar with this concept or framework? Okay. Okay, so maybe some of you have heard about it. I think really like this concept has really integrated into the mainstream just because of the sheer anti-Palestinian racism and discrimination that we've seen targeting our communities here in the US for their advocacy and speech in attempt to bring an end to the genocide. And so anti-Palestinian racism can be understood as the discriminatory and racist acts against Palestinians for their organizing and speech in support of Palestinian liberation. And this manifests in different ways, but I think it's really rooted in this dehumanization and devaluing of Palestinian life that to say that there's like this exception to Palestinian free speech and organizing. And also, it's also manifested in the defaming of Palestinians and their allies. And so, something that we commonly see, and I think one of the most prominent threats that are facing the movement have been these false and inflammatory accusations that are made against those who advocate for Palestinian liberation in an attempt to censor and to repress their advocacy and speech. And these accusations are really politicized, and they underlie many of the attacks that we see on advocates who are speaking out for Palestinian rights. And this is a phenomenon that Palestine Legal has been pushing back against since our inception. And I think so there's the false accusations of support for terrorism, and then there's also these inflammatory accusations of anti-Semitism, which are really both strategies by pro-Israel lobby groups that have been used for decades, and especially over the last year have been echoed by US elected officials, by university administration, and the mainstream media in order to justify this McCarthyite political crackdown on the Palestine movement that has grown and strengthened over the last 15 months, protesting to bring an end to this genocide. And this political repression, the scale of the political repression that we've seen is really signals of fear and the shift of public opinion in this unprecedented moment of popular support for the Palestinian struggle. So we can go to the next slide. And so why does anti-Palestinian racism matter? We believe that Palestinians and their allies and those associated with our cause should be able to freely advocate for Palestine without fear of reprisal or discrimination. And we see sort of anti-Palestinian racism as a way to build solidarity with others who are struggling for other oppressed nations or causes, because we know that the government or the Trump administration is trying to isolate the Palestine movement, but it has ripple effects on all social justice causes. And we can go to the next slide and I'll pass it back to Sabia.
So before we get into talking about the trends of repression that we've seen at Palestine Legal and try to categorize them for you, wanted to ask this discussion question that folks can chime in on, which is, what are some examples of repression that you have seen yourself, or maybe you've experienced it within the last 15 months since October 7th? So I'm seeing in the chat, um, Nida mentioned firing over social media posts. Halima mentioned IRA, which is related to what Lena was just saying, which is, for those of you, does everyone know what IRA is? Um, so I'll just quickly explain it. It's basically it's the International Holocaust Remembrance Act. That's what it stands for, definition of anti-Semitism, which essentially gives many examples of what anti-Semitism supposedly is by connecting it to Israel. So it's essentially equating anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism, with criticism of Israel. And many institutions have been adopting IRA. It's a goal of the Trump administration for for Department of Education to look at complaints, under this IRA framework. I mean, whether he wants to have a Department of Education at all is a different thing, but for IRA to be something that how we see anti-Semitism. I'm missing other things here, but I see in the chat, someone said on college campuses, locally, when we try to hold a protest, TikTok ban, students being doxxed, expelling student activists. We've definitely seen that. Also suspensions. Another comment about school disciplinary actions. So, um, and if folks want to chime in and explain any more about any of these things, I don't want to read out everything because there's a lot of stuff here. And clearly, everyone here on this call has experienced or has seen these types of repression in your day-to-day lives. So you know exactly what we're going to talk about today. But if no one wants to come off the mic and share for now, we do have another discussion question later. So maybe we can get people to speak then. We can move on to the next slide for now. Oh wait, I see a couple of hands. Carol and Halima, whoever wants to go for it.
I will just start out, and I don't have personal experiences here, but just I guess it's a measure of my ignorance or naivete or something, but I just cannot, I cannot fathom the amount of repression that I've been seeing from university campuses against pro-Palestinian supporters. I just, from the top down, bringing in the police, expelling people, arresting them. I just cannot get over this level of repression, and I never understood how just widespread and just horrible it is. I just had to say that. I just am constantly, and I feel for everyone and just can't, say enough how much I support all the students and everyone else who's doing this. But thank you. Just wanted to get that out.
Thanks so much for sharing, Carol. Let's go to Halima and then Ala can go after.
Yeah, I just wanted to say real quickly, I think like one of the most aggressive forms of repression that like we see on a continuous basis is every time any politician mentions Palestine and the grief that's happening in Gaza, it's never alone. It's always sandwiched between any talks of Israel and attacks by Hamas. Like it's just it's like it's so deeply offensive that our grief can never just exist on its own. That it's always baited with something else that is inherently Islamophobic and racist towards Palestinians. And so I think I just wanted to speak to that.
Yeah. No, so true and so problematic. Thank you so much for sharing, Halima. Ala?
Hello, everyone. I just wanted to comment on, I guess, the most prominent example of the repression, which was the encampment protests. I guess just reflecting on its future now, it's kind of crazy to see how historical that was, because that was the most prominent example of repression, just because it was just months and months. After students were trying to do something on campus, whether reaching out to their professors or upper staff or whatnot, and we all saw how it just boiled over and how it inspired other students across the country and how the media really portrayed it. And I'm not sure if you guys are gonna address that aspect, how any kind of student protesting on campus by Palestinian students has always been covered more negatively in the media versus these gross Zionists on campus. I mean, they can walk around and just do whatever. I mean, we've seen some of these campus even invite lower ranking Israeli soldiers onto campuses. It's just crazy how deeply embedded and complicit America is, specifically the campuses. I don't think I don't think this has been even what's the word for it? I don't think you can say another historical example of this. Just the deep complicity among the students. It's not like that with South Africa. I mean, we talk about, human rights and international court, but this I feel is something that the student repression, the level of criminality on it is just unbelievable. I mean, that's really all I have to say.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Ala. I think what you're describing, part of what you're describing is this disparate treatment that we see, or a different treatment between, those who are advocating for Palestine and those who want to say anything in support of Israel on campuses or just anywhere really. And the treatment of those two is just um, so distinct. And we see how harshly universities and others are coming down on any sort of speech in support of Palestine. There's a clear double standard. Nida, I saw your hand up. Do you want to add a comment?
I think you mostly touched on it. That's why I kind of lowered my hand, but essentially, like the disparate treatment. It's been so blatantly obvious where someone can't say from the river to the sea, but just yesterday there was crime in South Florida, and they literally said death, full on murderous intent. That's okay to say. That's not dangerous to say, but you can't say free Palestine. Somehow that's hate speech.
Yeah. Thank you for expanding on that, Nida. So I think this is a really great conversation, and I want to continue it after we go through the trends of oppression that we've seen here at Pal Legal, and it's going to look really familiar to the things that you all have described. And then we'll come back with another discussion question. So can we go to the next slide, please? Okay. So here we see just a list that we've kind of compiled of different trends of repression. And I think maybe all of these or most of them have been mentioned already. So censorship, which is what we were just talking about, surveillance, employment consequences, law enforcement attacks, criminalization of Palestine advocacy, and even that is done in different ways as listed here. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, and one more slide. Thank you. So before I talk about surveillance, just want to quickly note about the censorship that we were just talking about, that this is one of the big ways that we've been seeing repression against Palestine movement. And this is in the university context, we see like different events being shut down by the university that are supposed to be in support of Palestine, being shut down for different reasons. Sometimes um, nothing great is really even articulated by the university, and sometimes it's under the guise of, oh, this is discriminatory, or it's support for terrorism, or things like that. These sorts of arguments that Lena had mentioned earlier that are really just anti-Palestinian racism that are used to censor speech for Palestine. And I see someone even mentioned in the chat here, Ahmed, that they were subject to having to take down their social media posts by their employer. So it's not just on campuses. This sort of censorship is happening um, in our workplaces and elsewhere. And so now I want to talk about surveillance, which is the slide that we see here. So surveillance is also one of the kinds of trends of oppression that we've seen. And so, for example, universities have surveilled students who have been protesting for Palestine. They've further stereotyped students that are Palestinian, Muslim, or Arab, or even those who might look like they are. And even those who aren't these identities, but are just out there protesting alongside their fellow Palestinian, Muslim, and Arab students. So these students are being typecast as criminals for their support of Palestine, and it has been leading to the university and also law enforcement coming in and surveilling these students and keeping tabs on the kinds of things that they've been doing. And one example of this is at Yale University, where we're labeled it here as a victory because it wasn't actually Legal that did this, but a student at Yale had filed a FOIA request, which is a request under the Freedom of Information Act to get documents from like a government or a public entity. They filed a FOIA request to get documents from Yale's police department. Um, and what they found was just a horrific treasure trove of emails and other things kind of exposing the wide network of how Yale police was surveilling Palestine protests, how they were keeping tabs on when events were happening and whether support, like law enforcement presence, was needed at events and things like that. This article screenshotted here is from Jewish Insider, so I would encourage folks who are interested in the story to go and read it. And you might be wondering, well, in this case, how did this student fight back against surveillance? How did they manage to FOIA Yale's police department? Isn't that a private entity? Well, in this case, I think this is one example of where, creative strategizing came in handy. Because in this case, what happened was Yale's police department was actually found to have been kind of like a public entity because of the level of power that they held. And this was um, something that happened back in 2008. The Connecticut Freedom of Information Commission decided that these abilities that the Yale Police Department has were so expansive that it basically made Yale a public agency. And so it was subject to things like FOIA. And this student was able to, she's a journalist, she was able to find out these things and get all this information and expose and shine a light on what was happening there. So this is just to show that surveillance is something that we've been seeing, and these are some ways. This is like one way that we've seen students fight back. Next slide, please. Another trend of oppression, which we just referenced earlier, is in workplaces. So in terms of what we've seen in the employment context, not just, I say, faculty and staff here facing employment consequences, but also just employees in their workplaces facing consequences for their speech in support of Palestine. And one example that we listed here that some of you may have heard of was Dr. Stephen Thrasher at Northwestern University. Dr. Thrasher had been put on paid leave from his teaching position back in September. And he was put through this whole disciplinary proceeding process after he participated in a student-led demonstration last spring, supporting Palestinians who were under Israeli bombardment in Gaza. And so after that, his classes were abruptly canceled, and he was denied due process in all of this. But Dr. Thrasher, fortunately, was able to be reinstated after enduring this grueling process of, having to engage with the school in this way. They found no cause for the suspension, and so he will resume teaching in April. And there was a lot of advocacy around when this happened to Dr. Thrasher He had a lot of people on his side. And so I think this is one example where, we see the power of raising awareness, and how that can help in the employment context. And this is just one victory that we see there. Next slide, please. I'll
Awesome.
pass it over to Lena.
Thanks, Abia. So I want to take a step back because, like, I think just to synthesize, like, some of the conversations that we had around some of the examples of anti-Palestinian racism we've seen, I think a lot of us really pointed to the examples that we've seen on campus. And so we have seen that Palestinians and allied students have been subjected to really horrible examples of discrimination and more generally just like a hostile environment on their campuses due to anti-Palestinian, Islamophobic, and anti-Arab statements, actions, or threats that have been made or exacerbated by either elected officials or the university leadership itself. And so what we've seen is that schools and universities, not only are they failing to address the concerns of Palestinians and allied students on campuses, but in many cases, they're also actively discriminating against them and contributing to this chilling and really hostile environment. And so this happens through some of the examples that Sabia had spoken to, like the censorship that students experience on campus. But also what we've seen is this weaponization of the student code of conduct policies that justifies this repression against Palestinian students and student groups, and try to instill these bureaucratic obstacles that effectively are used to target and to really silence student organizing on campus. And so we've seen, excuse me, an overwhelming sort of trend of universities invoking disciplinary processes against student organizers on campus. Um, and I want to also talk a little bit about an example of a victory, because oftentimes we hear a lot about the horrible acts of repression and violence, but it's also important to note that over the last 15 months, we've seen the growth and the strength of the Palestine movement here in the US, but really globally. So I want to talk a little bit about George Washington University. Um, since October 7th, the Students for Justice in Palestine chapter at GW had been subjected to a whole, like a lot of anti-Palestinian racism and repression for their advocacy on campus. And they were actually suspended since November 14th, 2023, for an action that was meant to honor the lives of over 6,000 Palestinians at the time during the start of Israel's genocide in Gaza. And since that event, GWSJP had been accused of a bunch of charges relating to protest-related violations for their events that have been organized alongside a student coalition in support of Palestine that have been mobilizing again to bring an end to this genocide. And this resulted in one of our clients being placed on disciplinary probation and removed from the leadership of the SJP, in this really blatant attempt to silence and discipline him for his speech and advocacy in support of Palestinian rights on campus. And at that point, the student group SJP was also at risk at permanent disbandment. And so again, stepping back to this larger objective of trying to thwart student organizing on campus. But it's important to note that we had filed a Title VI complaint against GW University in the previous year for its violations of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, because they had canceled a trauma support service for Palestinian students in 2021. And so we have sort of already acknowledged that there's a really hostile anti-Palestinian environment at George Washington University. And so we thought that it would be a perfect opportunity to lead an advocacy campaign that spoke to this hostile environment at GW. And so we organized an advocacy campaign around one of our clients and GW SJP to drop the charges that he and others were facing on campus. And we did an action alert that resulted in over 950 people sending an action or sending an email to the director of the Student Code of Conduct to tell them to drop the charges against SJP and our clients. And thankfully, after that campaign, all the charges were dropped and SJP was reinstated. You can go to the next slide. I think somebody also spoke to this in the chat, but these policies and how they're sort of introducing new ones that are again meant to disproportionately target Palestine organizing on campus. And so we've seen universities introduce these new student code of conduct policies that are again intended to censor and punish students for their work on campus. And just to share really briefly here, we also wanted to share a story of a victory where on September 17th, so earlier this year, CARE and Palestine Legal had sued the University of Maryland for revoking permission that it gave to the Students for Justice in Palestine chapter to hold an event on campus that was supposed to be commemorative again of the Palestinian martyrs after October 7th. And the University of Maryland, the censorship of the SJP really came after this like lobbying of pro-Israel groups to punish and to censor this vigil that the SJP was holding. And so again, we had sued the University of Maryland, and we had said that this constitutes unlawful and content-based discrimination that's in violation of the students' First Amendment rights. And exciting that the court had ruled that the university's decision had violated their First Amendment rights, and the court ordered the university to allow the vigil to proceed. We can go to the next slide.
Thanks, Lena. I also want to add to what Lena was saying just now about the Maryland case, because and some of you may have been familiar with what happened at the University of Maryland, but it was so egregious the way the university was trying to quash this vigil. So initially, they had actually approved the event. They approved SJP to have this event. And then the way that they, came in and decided, never mind, we're not going to have this event, is they decided there will be no student held events at all on October 7th. Like nobody. And that was their way, I guess, of trying to be neutral. But it was obviously in response to this event. And they couldn't really hide away from that fact. And thankfully, as Lena said, the court did side with the students. And the event, I think, was maybe even more well attended than it would have been without all of this attention on it. So that's even better. So I want to talk about this trend of law enforcement attacks. And I know this was also mentioned in the chat earlier when we were talking about what are the trends that we've seen or experienced. And you all might have seen it on the campuses around you, or you yourself may have experienced this on or off campus, where law enforcement has come in sometimes, many times, universities being the ones who leverage their own police. They might leverage local, like city police and even state police to attack and arrest their own students. And we've seen this happen on, several different campuses. And especially around the time of the encampments, we kept seeing stories, and you might have too, about how intense the police repression was against students, and how universities just condoned that happening. And in particular, one example I want to pull out from this is at Emory University in Georgia. They had their encampment in April of last year. And during the encampment, Emory police came in. with the backing of local Atlanta police, and then also the Georgia State Patrol came in. So all of these police forces were mobilized against a peaceful, encampment happening on this campus. Um, and they all came down and started, arresting students. Also, they tased a black medic who was present at the encampment. They pushed a professor to the pavement. There was so much brutality that came out of that one example, and I'm sure that you all might know of other examples at other universities where there have been similar things that have happened. um, and so at Emory, we at Legal, along with CARE Georgia, CARE is the Council on American Islamic Relations, their Georgia chapter, and ourselves, we filed a Title VI complaint, so an anti-discrimination complaint, telling the Department of Education that there has been anti-Palestinian racism going on Emory's campus. And one of the examples we gave to them during the investigation was what happened at the encampment last April. And so just want to talk about one victory that came out of that is, the Department of Education made their decision about the investigation. They gave Emory a lot of homework to do, different changes that they have to make the environment at Emory more equitable. And to be honest with you, the language in the final document that they released, their agreement with Emory, was very tame. It was very objective, not very much mention at all, actually, no mention of Palestine at all. So, in my view, that aspect of it was quite problematic. But they also, outside of this officially published agreement, they also sent a letter to Emory that said specifically, we need you to send us information about the way that you responded to that protest last spring, because we have concerns that the way that you responded was like that there were concerns about that being inappropriate or like contributing to a hostile environment on campus. So we need more information about how Emory responded. And I know that may seem kind of, maybe it doesn't seem so significant, but I think in this context, we see a government body telling Emory, we have concerns that you have mistreated these students who are Palestinian Muslim Arab students on your campus, and you need to show us how you reacted to that student protest. And so, it gives us maybe some hope that Emory has to face some sort of accountability for the way it acted on that day. But again, I think we're counting our victories here. Obviously, there's pluses and minuses to even this example, but just wanted to share that example with you all. Next slide, please. And I think this will be our last slide on the trends of repression. So as we end here, want to just talk about the criminalization of Palestine advocacy, and I'm sure we've seen this all happen in different ways. And one of the things that has been happening is the congressional investigations against various schools. How many of you maybe tuned in to C-SPAN when those investigations were going on, when they brought in college presidents to sit in front of the House committee and answer questions? Yeah, so these congressional investigations have been going on for almost a year now, I think, of colleges, like these sorts of hearings that they've had. And you might remember the one with Columbia, which happened on April 17th, 2024, where Columbia's president at the time, Manu Shafiq, was present at the hearing. And right around the same time, we had the Gaza Solidarity Encampment at Columbia begin. And so I just want to highlight these two examples of the kinds of repression coming down on the government level, but also the response of the students to continue their advocacy for Palestine in this really big way. After that encampment, the way it ended, over 100 students were suspended and arrested on Columbia's campus. Just really huge, egregious numbers. Also showcasing just the number of students that really came out to support Palestine, despite the kind of repressive campus that we all know Columbia to be. So yeah, just want to highlight that one example, and I'll pass it over to Lena to talk more about other types of criminalization.
Yeah, just super briefly, I think one of the other sort of efforts of criminalization of Palestine advocacy that we've seen, not only over the last year, though it's been exacerbated, but really over the span of the last few decades, has been lawfare that has been targeting Palestinian organizations. And so we've seen, you know, pro-Israel lobby groups file a bunch of meritless civil lawsuits attempting to further expand an already chilling and expansive set of US anti-terrorism laws against humanitarian organizations, student organizers, and grassroots advocacy groups. And, you know, they really are part of a racist attack that's intended on isolating um, Palestinian organizing by criminalizing that work and also humanitarian aid. And it's also meant to distract and to drain the resources of organizers, organizations away from advancing the Palestinian struggle and to focus on responding to these lawsuits. And so some of the work that we've been doing in this front has been doing some education work with Palestine community organizations to do sort of know your rights trainings around these material support for terrorism laws to empower our communities to safely organize in support of the cause. And I'll pass it back to Sabia.
Thanks, Lena. I'll wrap up this section by just saying, before we get to this discussion question, about a kind of newer manifestation that we've seen under the Trump presidency of criminalization of Palestine advocacy. And you all probably already know what I'm talking about, but just the executive orders, for example, and how we've seen one of the more recent executive orders targeting those who aren't citizens, who have like spoken out in support of Palestine, and trying to get universities themselves to target their own students and to identify their own students and present them to the government so that they can be dealt with. Um, and that is one of the more recent forms that we're seeing, and that organizations and activists are having to grapple with and try to organize around at this time. And you all maybe are affiliated with different campuses or have been at other campuses, and maybe have seen if your universities have responded in some way to this executive order, and maybe they've been silent. But this is something that that activists are having to deal with. Under the Trump administration, we're seeing other ways of criminalization of Palestine advocacy. Okay, next slide, please. So I said we'd be back to discussion, and here we are. So are there successful strategies that you all have seen to push back against repression that you've either seen or experienced yourself? I would hope there's some success you guys have seen.
Not to make a plug. Oh, wait, guys, raise your hands. Rania, go ahead. Or I was gonna make a pack plug, so Rania, go for it.
Thanks, Basma. So I was gonna say, I think we actually had an experience with Montclair University. They had canceled an event. It was basically a fundraiser, but they worked with UNRWA, and the president, because of a bunch of technical reasons, ended up canceling the event, but it wasn't really for technical reasons. It was clearly because of they got a bunch of Zionists that were messaging them. But the way that we did it, we kind of helped. So I think this is also like a different way of looking at it. We've been working on a long-term relationship with Montclair and the president. And so when this went down, we kind of, sat on the table and talked with the president to kind of figure out how we could move forward with this, and kind of explained how what happened was very, very problematic. And so we were able to get the event rescheduled, and similar to the events that you were saying, was actually more successful than it was because there was a lot of obviously buzz around it. I think that's one big example. Another example I could think of too is at PAC, we actually almost had a Board of Education forum canceled it was the same thing because it was around October 7th, and a lot of because just merely because we're Palestinians, suddenly a lot of people that have been with us for years did not want to come in anymore. And I think the way that we kind of did it was we went with the very technical terms, like we are still who we are, things have not changed. And we kind of spelled out things to the T where they couldn't, like they kept trying to get us out of it, but we kept like bringing back to like, the very, very basics, like in the sense that this is something that we do every year and that this is a forum and there's nothing. And so they couldn't but keep it because then they would have faced a lot of legal trouble if they tried to cancel it. And so we kept it, and it was actually our most successful Board of Education forum because our community really showed up for it. I think we had over like 200 people show up. So I think that's another really good way. So it's more of like a strategic long-term planning way of like building relationships. And in a far way of kind of knowing that there could be legal action, but kind of in the sense of like building long-term relationships. And I think that's what makes PAC really special, is that we're here for the long run, and we're institution building and organizing our community in a way that's not, it's not just for like the short term, it's really to change things in the long term.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Rania. Let's go to Lamia and then Manar.
I was gonna say that in a similar way to a couple of the schools you mentioned at Rutgers, we were the first public school to get suspended after October 7th for our organizing um for Palestine. And I remember a strategy that we used was we created a campaign around We Are All SJP, where we got over 200 student orgs to like sign on, and then we did a protest because we felt like, well, we knew that the suspension was unfair because they claimed that our chants were like anti-Semitic, like, like Zionist propaganda and stuff. Um, and so after we did the protest, admin was willing to meet with us, and it was a long couple of months, but we were able to kind of get our SJP back so that in the spring we were stronger than we were in the fall. But yeah, I think that was a successful one. And then I also know um another like successful strategy is we kept track of all the ways admin and Rutgers tried to suppress us, and we actually worked with Pal Legal to get kind of uh like a lawsuit against them for anti-Palestinian racism with Rutgers Newark. And alhamdulillah, it passed, I think, like last month. So we were like where it proved that Rutgers was participating in anti-Palestinian racism, which was really good to see as somebody that graduated last semester.
Thanks so much for sharing, Lamia. And yeah, I just wanted to correct that. I think it was the Anti-Arab Discrimination Committee, ADC, that submitted that for y'all. But yeah, ADC is great too. Manar?
So, part of a group that I'm in, Teaching While Muslim, and Educators for Palestine, we were getting like a lot of backlash, and we usually do like social media campaigns when we know like a teacher is getting fired or on paid leave. And there was an incident with the Newark public school district where it seemed like the Jewish Federation of Metro West pressured the superintendent to say that they were no longer going to teach a book about Palestine, a little piece of the ground. And we honestly just did our homework on what actually happened, and we found out that he couldn't make that executive decision without the Board of Education like voting on it. And so we contacted as many teachers locally that we knew. And we just happened to find out that one of the professors at Rutgers Newark, that's part of like an anti-Zionist Jewish group, was actually one of the book editors from like the 90s, like late 90s. And she came out to the board meeting, and we all like signed up to speak, and kind of called out the superintendent making this like executive order. And then and she made it very clear that there was no anti-Semitism. There was actually, the word Jewish was not mentioned in the entire book. And so they were saying how like that accusation like was basically false. But I think having such a big coalition of teachers that read the book and wanted to teach the book, and also having the book editor and calling out, making an executive decision without the board voting. And to be completely honest, Nork is pretty pro-Palestine in general when it comes to like teachers, and you can teach about it. And they made an executive vote right then and there that day that the superintendent was no longer allowed to make any curriculum claims or any executive decisions with outside orgs without the Board of Education actually voting. And I honestly think it also showed the citizens of Newark that they can bring up these issues, because the board, like literally on stage, was arguing with the superintendent about the decision that he made. And so there was this also moment of transparency for the community to know that they have these rights and that they can hold someone accountable. And simply because you're the superintendent doesn't mean you can just make these executive orders by being pressured by an outside organization that doesn't even work within the community. But I definitely think it was just the push of making sure we knew who to contact and having a variety of like coalitions showing up.
Um, that's amazing, Mona. Thank you so much for sharing that example. Yeah, all of these examples are great, and it's uplifting to hear them, and I hope it feels that way for people after hearing our really long discussion on repression that we've been seeing. Um, I don't see any other hands. Is there anyone else who wants to talk about successes before we move on to the last portion of our presentation? Okay, I'm not seeing anyone. So yeah, let's talk about, now that we talked about what we've been seeing, talked about the successes, let's talk about how do we keep it going? So how do we continue to build this resilience, and make sure that activists are safe and protecting themselves, as best they can as they move forward in this really repressive environment? Um, so, one of the things, as I mentioned, that Palestine Legal does is know your rights trainings. And so I think one thing for you all is to stay plugged in, if you aren't already, into the work that Palestine Legal is doing. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter to stay up to date on the resources that we are putting out for these. If there's trainings that we're publicizing, to come and be a part of those, and learn about your rights. Or on our stories, you might see us share something from a different partner org that is helpful, that might help you learn something new. Definitely stay in touch in that way. And then also with resources, I'm going to put a couple of resources in the chat. So one of the things that, is really important in this day and age is digital security. So, we're all chronically online, most of us. And so digital security is something that's especially important. So how are we protecting ourselves online as we move about, protecting ourselves from things like doxing, especially having our personal info be out there in the world, and available for others to see. So kind of minimizing that as best as we can. Um, so if you bear with me for a second, and I'll tell you what I'm putting in the chat. So this first resource is from Equality Labs. So they do work on educating people about things like digital security, helping giving people anti-doxing resources. And so this guide here is kind of like the technical stuff, like how do you actually go about doing the protecting that I'm talking about. And then we also have this resource here for you guys. This one kind of gives a broader overview for just talking about what I'm talking about. Like, what is Sabia even talking about? What is the security that I need to be aware of? And so if you read that second document, it kind of gives you like an overview to ground you in why security is important, and how we can start to do that. So these are just some resources to get us started. I'll pass it over to Lena for the next slide.
Thanks, Sophia, for keeping us safe. Let's go to the next slide. So, just like reflecting on some of the things that you all had shared in terms of successful strategies to fight back against repression, but also advance victories for our movement. Like, I think one of the core um, takeaways was around the collective strength that we have when we are organizing together and either through organizations or in community groups. Like, this is so incredibly important to demonstrate both strength and power and also resiliency, knowing that everything that's up against us, whether it's these anti-Palestinian legislations or EOs, censorship, like all of these sort of tactics that are meant to chill or isolate us, can be fought back through the collective. And so through collective actions, through campaigns, through protests, absolutely, Halima. Like these small habits do really make big changes, and so it's important to stay organized. And really, I think somebody else had mentioned it, but having I think it was Rania, having these deep-rooted relationships in the community is also a way that you are able to stay safe in the face of repression. Um, Also for us to fight back through taking control of the narrative. I think one of the things that has really been advanced into somewhat in the mainstream is around this framework of anti-Palestinian racism and seeing the ways that Palestinians and those who speak out in support of Palestinian liberation are disproportionately targeted for their speech and advocacy in support of Palestinian rights. And it's important that we are speaking out and also documenting our experiences, the repression that we've seen, and also how we're fighting back. These are important stories to be shared. And also understanding that, again, no matter the chilling anti-Palestinian legislation or some of the executive orders that we're seeing, it's incredibly important to continue invoking our constitutional and civil rights and to speak out for Palestine. This is our collective duty as people as of consciousness to be able to speak in support of Palestinian liberation and also to practice self-care, whatever that looks like to you, whether it's being in your community, doing community work, or having revolutionary self-care every once in a while, really important to keep us sustained for the long haul. Next slide. So these are some ways that Palestine Legal can support you all. I think on the legal front, if you are a community organizer and you're seeing these anti-Palestinian legislation introduced in your locals, you can submit a question about what does this mean for my organizing through our intake form. So we're able to do that. And then also to advise you if you are going through disciplinary proceedings or issues on your campus, and also other issues of discriminatory treatment that you might be experiencing. And we're also able to refer you to attorneys, even if we don't necessarily deal with the issue that you're facing with. On the advocacy front, we're happy to strategize with you all around campaign strategies or some work, campaign work that you're doing locally, and also be able to connect you with resources and also connect you all with other movement partners and organizations as well. On the media front, though we're extremely strapped for capacity on the comms front, but if we do support you with some of offer legal support, can train students through media trainings to build up that skill set as well. And we can go to the next slide. And Tibia, I think I'm passing it to you.
Thanks, Lena. So we did it. We reached the last slide. This is just some, parting words of how to contact us. That you have our email there, info@palestinelegal.org. Although I will say, if you are trying to reach us about like an incident that has happened to you or seeking legal advice or something like that, that you should get in touch with us through our intake form, which I will put in the chat here, rather than emailing the info at. The intake form is the best way. Oh, thanks, Lena, for to get in touch with us about your incident, and it also helps us to keep track of who's coming to us. So you have that email there, and then also our Twitter, pal_legal, and the same for our Instagram. And then, our website, you can visit us there and learn more about the work that we've done and the work that we are currently doing, palestinelegal.org. So yeah, that's all on our end. Thanks all.
Thank you guys so much. So we did end this portion a little early, so if it's all right with you, if anyone has any questions, you can either put them in the chat or raise your hand and unmute. But thank you both so much for joining us tonight. Thank you for all the great work Palestine Legal does. We did link, I know you guys linked it too. We linked it earlier, the website and the intake form. And I'll make sure to put that in our Google Classroom and our WhatsApp chats as well. Okay, I see Rami has a question.
Hi, yes. I just first off want to thank both of you and applaud your organization for what you guys have done. So my question is, isn't there a way for us to do like a class action lawsuit against the government? Because us as taxpayers kind of makes us like shareholders. So I was thinking because they're making us complicit in the genocide, to mismanagement, misusing the funds that they get from us. And that's not more evident, I feel like, than after the LA wildfires, how they had money, like how California had money to give to Israel, but they didn't have water or enough firefighters because they cut their budget, right? To a conflict of interest, even because if not all, but most of them are supported by AIPAC. So, their interest is supporting Israel and not the American community or country. I always thought about this. I didn't know who to ask or where to go to. So I don't know if you guys could shed some light on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rami, for your question. I think it's really like great that to come up with these ideas of like how can we fight back against what's happening, especially because a lot of times, we as activists in this space are kind of like on the defensive and like responding to things that are happening to us rather than going on the offensive and like taking that action ourselves. So I really appreciate bringing that into this space, on how do we take like offensive actions, ourselves. I can't, I think what you're asking is a much bigger conversation, and I think it is definitely one that should be had for sure. And I think, there are others as well who are having these discussions about how can we utilize the law to try to do something for ourselves. Like this seems really unjust, so how can we do that ourselves? I don't know if I think paralegal, our on our end, on our capacity, I don't think this is the type of lawsuit that we would be able to do ourselves. But I do think the idea that you have is worth considering further and talking about. Okay, like I have this idea. What laws make sense here? Like, what laws could we actually sue under? Like, who is interested in this sort of lawsuit? And you might start with a big idea and might pare it down to something a lot more specific, but that's just kind of the journey kind of it might take to when you have a legal idea for a lawsuit. What it actually comes down to might be different than what you initially thought, but I think that that's a great idea to start with. And I think it's great for us in the movement to think about how we can go on the offensive as well.
Thank you so much.
Let's see. I see Ala, your hand up.
Yes, hi again. So, I have two questions. So, my first question is what do you see the future of Palestinians and lobby in general? Just because I've always wanted, well, I didn't always want to, but the people around me encouraged me to be a lawyer, and I kind of just went with it, just because I don't have the grades and kind of skill set for it, I guess. But then after seeing the genocide and how law firms were just firing their Palestinian or Muslim employees for being outspoken about this, and or also I've been hearing some new hires being made to sign a form condemning Hamas as part of their potential employment with the firm. It made me question twice whether I actually want to go into this field. So that's actually my first question. And then secondly, you two ladies have been with Paligo, I don't know how long, but how did you guys even get into this field of work? What kind of experience did you have litigating these kind of cases? So that's all.
Alec, can I ask you to repeat the first question just really quickly?
Oh, just what is the future of Palestinian and or I guess Palestinian advocacy for those who are working in law firms? So
Okay,
I yeah,
got it.
that's it.
Um, I can take the first part of that, I guess. Just I guess the future of Palestine advocacy in law firms. I mean, I think it depends also like what law firm you're at, and like there are definitely some of the really big law firms that have been very explicit that they do not support the protests that have been happening. I'm not sure if you saw, Ella, that there were a bunch of like I think firms that said, we're not gonna hire, like we don't want people who
Yeah.
are participating in these like anti-Semitic kinds of protests. So,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of big names were on there. So I think, in terms of the future of like Palestine advocacy in spaces like that, I think there's a lot of work to like undo that sort of environment there. And that's not an easy thing necessarily, but I think this is the kind of challenge that a lot of people are facing in their workplaces, whether law firms or not, is how to push back against that environment. And part of it starts with having um, kind of a cohort of people who are on the same side and who also want to see a change, and who want their employment spaces to take anti-Palestinian racism seriously as a form of discrimination and making it clear that like this is discrimination. Um, so, in terms of those sorts of law firms, I think there's that challenge. And in terms of law firms where it is easier to organize on this question, um, I think having kind of getting involved, or having your law firm get involved in Palestine litigation, or in supporting student activists in different ways. At Legal, we have a really large, thankfully, network of attorneys who are from all different places. So we have folks at law firms, we have folks at other orgs, like nonprofits, who have volunteered their time. They don't work for Legal, but they volunteer their time to support support activists how they can. And they all have different kinds of expertise. And so they come to us as volunteers telling us like, this is the area that I know. Send me students who are facing arrest because I'm a criminal attorney, or who are being fired because I'm an employment attorney. So, using the strengths that you have is also one way. I'll pass it to Lena if you want to answer the second part of the question, though, about
Um,
how we came to how legal.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Again, like I was born and raised in Canada and was doing organizing work on my campus and also in the community there. And um, during my time during my undergraduate degree, had faced a lot of the trends of repression that we outlined as a student, and at one point was threatened with expulsion from my university. And I think my individual experience, along with some of the other students that I was organizing, and just really taken aback by the level of repression that we had experienced, and then seeing it on this really large scale all across North America. Really, it's not exceptional to the US. But I remember looking at Palestine Legal's work despite living in another country and wishing that something like this had existed for us in Canada. And so when I had moved here, was really wanting to work at Palestine Legal. And despite not being a lawyer, my role isn't a lawyer at Palestine Legal. The work that I do is doing campaign work around some of our casework to really empower students. And so um, thinking through how to support students in crafting an advocacy strategy around some of the repression that they face to help empower folks. Because a lot of the times, you know, it might feel really difficult to push back against some of the university administration's crackdowns on student organizing. And so, yeah, came to Palestine Legal as somebody who, is very similar to a lot of the client stories that we get. Yeah, I hope that answers your question, and thank you for the thoughtful question.
Definitely, thank you. Thank you both.
I think
Thanks,
that,
Ella.
oh,
Danielle, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, I had a question just just because you guys like studied law and stuff. I'm wondering if you guys have any advice about like arguing with people and like debating and stuff. Because I feel like for me, I tend to like forget all my facts, get nervous, and like people start like yelling at me. I don't know how to hold my ground. I'm like wondering as like legal people, like you might be able to give advice for that maybe a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, Danielle, I'm not sure who you're arguing with, but I hope these people are worth your time. Because that's like, I guess one of the first things, right? Is like, I feel you. I think I have the same problem too, and I'm a lawyer. Like, it's just hard to have all the facts in your head and ready to go, especially against people who are not there to listen to you. And so if you're arguing with people who don't actually want to know. And these are people who are just, Zionists, they're just set in their way, they're just there to tell you why Palestinians don't matter. Then I don't, no matter how many facts you have, it's not going to change anything. And I don't mean to say that in like, oh, there's no room for discussion or, whatever. It's just about preserving your peace too, Danielle. But I think, in terms of how to stay up to date on like what you should say when you're in some sort of discussion like that. Um, I mean, I'm gonna plug again Legal and our website, but I think, we have a lot of resources on there about just what are the common repression like trends that we're seeing now, how do we want to fight back against those things and like the arguments that we're making. And so if it's helpful to you to look at that, I would recommend like reading up on some of the campaigns that we've been a part of and some of the arguments that we've made in different school university contexts when we're faced with these questions of, why should we care about anti-Palestinian racism? And hopefully that can be one way. And then I also see Halima in the chat with a toolkit from PAC. So those are some resources I think to refer to.
I think there were questions for us, Sabia, in the chat.
Yeah.
One, awesome. Maybe we could tackle those. One was from Rania around if that we spoke a little bit about IRA earlier in the presentation, and if we can talk about the role that Palestine Legal has played in this. Maybe I can speak to this.
Yeah, please.
Okay, maybe I can speak to this really quickly, and Sabia, if you have anything to add, go for it. A lot of the work that I've done in my role has been around like policy work, specifically with the of Education on the issue of anti-Palestinian racism. But the Department of Education was basically going through a rulemaking process after the Trump executive order when he was last in office in 2019 that gave guidance to all federal agencies to consider using the IRA definition. And so what that would mean for the Department of Education is that they would need to consider this executive order and the definition of IRA, along with its accompanying examples when reviewing Title VI discrimination cases that were filed with the Department of Education. Obviously, we know that this would be incredibly catastrophic and further exacerbate anti-Palestinian racism that we're seeing and the censorship of speech and advocacy on campuses. And so the Department of Education had to go under this rulemaking process to determine whether or not they'd adopt IRA into any or codify it into their policies when reviewing these complaints. And so for 2 years, I've been lobbying the Department of Education by sending them two, two or three separate letters explaining how the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, um, and along with its examples and how we've seen it used on university campuses to silence faculty and students, further exacerbates anti-Palestinian racism. Why? Because we've seen incidents of surveillance, of censorship, cancellation of events, all these horrible things that we spoke to earlier in the presentation. And I'm happy to drop these links in the chat. These letters are public, so folks can read through that. And if these arguments are helpful in your advocacy, please feel free to use them. And twice the Department of Education had postponed its rule on IRA, which we take it as a good sign that they understand that there are First Amendment issues with IRA that would prevent folks from criticizing the state of Israel and speaking freely in support of Palestinian rights. And also, yeah, so they have acknowledged these sort of issues with the IRA definition. So that's some of the work that we've done. I don't know, Sabia, if there's anything. Okay, nothing else to add. I think there was a second question in the chat.
Yeah, I see one from Haya.
Yeah.
So Haya says, I had a question about Trump going after the Department of Education. If he does succeed in what he wants to do, what does this mean for your advocacy or slash litigation? Lena, if you want to go for it, you can. I'm happy to as well.
Yeah, I think the Trump administration is just, he's proving himself to be really chaotic, says one thing, don't know if it's going to happen. So it's really, we're in a really unpredictable political climate and terrain. I don't know entirely if the Department of Education is going to be shut down. I think it's a little bit of a wait and see, but we know that, under this new administration, and the new education of secretary, that the Department of Education is going to be a potentially hostile climate for Palestinian students that are filing complaints with the Department of Education. So it does make us reconsider whether or not this is a strategy that we want to pursue with respect to filing complaints with the Department of Education. I think a lot of our advocacy, I'll speak for some of the advocacy, a lot of the kind of work that we've been doing with the Department of Education over the last 3 years has been doing having like these meetings to educate them on what is anti-Palestinian racism, what are the manifestations that we've seen, using specific case examples across schools and universities in the US. And they ended up publishing a Dear Colleague letter that states that Palestinian students can't be discriminated against under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which is huge, but also it's, um, just by having the word Palestinian in there doesn't mean that they're acting on like resolving these complaints in a way that is actually addressing the concerns of Palestinian students on campuses. So there's definitely limitations to that, but I think would need to pivot from the Department of Education to really focus on some of the grassroots work and uplifting and empowering them.
Yeah. There's actually a question in the chat from like earlier during our presentation that we didn't get to, and I don't want to forget about it. It's from Alex, who says, most of the free speech lawsuits that have gone forward have been successful. No, does it ever get to the point of ridiculousness for y'all where it's such an obvious breach of constitutional free speech? Yes. So I mean, I don't think this requires too much for me to say here. So in terms of like whether all free speech lawsuits that have gone forward have been successful, I don't think I can speak to all of them. Not sure if I'm aware of all of them, but in terms of whether this gets to the point of ridiculousness, I think yes. Lena and I at Legal, and I'm sure you all have just seen really ridiculous examples of things that are considered um, anti-Semitism and therefore discriminatory and then shut down. Whether it's just something like a protest or things like putting up poster or like stickers or just anything. We've seen so many different examples of repression like that, and then also um the way that students are, if this is a student context, the way that students are then like disciplined for something as ridiculous as like putting up stickers that might say something like, from the river to the sea or something else in support of Palestine. um I see a question from Allah. She says, speaking of lawyers reaching out to you in their expertise, have any lawyers who are experts in any field of international law, say, for example, international human rights or international criminal law, reached out to you? Was thinking we need to fight our cases outside of US borders as a way of holding the US accountable. I'm not sure if we have, I mean, I'm sure there's like people who have come to us with all sorts of expertise. So there's probably folks who have come to us who know way more than I do about these areas of law. Um, and yeah, I mean, I can't speak to fighting cases outside of US borders. That, working in forums like the International Criminal Court and things like that is kind of outside of the purview of what Legal does, since we're mostly, domestic based. Um, but, I think there's so many different fronts for us to fight this fight on. And I don't see any other questions in the chat. So if anyone has any last things they want to say, if not, it was great speaking with you all.
Thank you. And there are some links in the chat, what Nina mentioned, and what Sabia mentioned about what Legal has done with the fact sheet. There's a fact sheet about the IRA definition and how it's the distorted definition of that. I'll save all of these, so then when you look at the recording, you'll see those, and then I'll try to put whatever I can on Google Classroom as well. So if everyone can stay on just a little longer, we have a little bit more to our class. Sabia and Dina, thank you both so much. And I know it's late. We really appreciate it. Dina, I hope you feel better. I saw you have like a little bit of a cough. So thank you both for still coming.
Thanks so much.
It's always great to have you guys. Thank you so much.
Bye, y'all.
Bye. Okay. Thanks guys. So I think we might actually finish like one time a little bit early, but I do have a little bit. So next week are actually going to be focusing on actions for Palestine, but there were a few things that tie really well into today's class, so I do want to share with you all today. Okay, let me just view here. Okay. So on the note of talking about advocacy and actions, we're gonna center us back into PAC work specifically. So if you see this QR code, really quick, this is our Palestine Action Collective. This is actually going to be launching newly. We've started collecting any interest forms. So if you're interested in getting involved, we're going to be, this is basically to help boost our Palestine education department and advocacy, so you can get involved through supporting our education events, through supporting and building upon the resources. So if you've seen, and if you follow our Google Classroom, you'll see we have a lot. So we have our toolkits, we have resource guides, we have a Zionist talking points guide that I mentioned in the chat, and a lot of other things like that, talking to kids guide. So if you join, you could help support that work and those efforts in building those resources further. And then with our events, and then also we do some direct actions within our community. So if you live in the immediate area, you can help support us through that as well. So if you scan the QR code here, or if you want to go on our website, you can find both of those links there. So I do encourage and hope that anyone who's interested can join. And you can either like participate remotely or in person, depending on your interest and what you can do, and obviously how close you are. And next, I'm actually going to ask Halima. Halima is our civic engagement advocacy manager to share a little bit about the work she's been doing, and a really great event that's coming up actually very soon, especially if you're in person.
Yes. Thank you so much, Besma. Yeah, Poly Legal shares some really great resources as we continue to deal with our political climate. I think now more than ever, we recognize the need to continue to build up community and really share information and resources. So we've been working on a resource guide. It's got over 100 different resources from different organizations that we work with, and resources from the city and the state that can help anywhere from in terms of free financial planning, immigration rights, knowing your rights. Pali Legal's on our resource guide as well. In terms of what to do if you're dealing with police brutality, who to call if you need your road fixed. All of that is in the resource guide, and we're going to be going over that and how to use it and how to share it with others, as well as having some other speakers come in and talk a little bit about the work that they do. So that's going to be Wednesday next week. So a week from tomorrow. Highly recommend coming, and I always encourage everyone to bring others with them to the event as well. Even if you don't need the resources, you could then become a resource to somebody else, and this is going to continue to be increasingly important as we build community. And then IRA's come up a lot. IRA is incredibly important to all the work that we do. It's our ability to be able to call out Zionism and criticize Israel. And it is, and we are at a point now with IRA where we have never gotten before with it, where it's become widely known amongst the Assembly and the Senate as controversial. It's been defeated in the past, and then what happens is kind of like sports, like a new team that comes in, um, which is what the elections are, and which is why it continues to come up. Um, but that's why it's labeled consistency and urgency, and I stress the idea of small habits. I always see politics as a form of health, and how we engage with politics as a form of health. Small habits create big change. So taking some time to look at the No IRA website, look into your district, see which district you're in. All of those instructions are on the website. See who your senator is and who your two assembly people are, and just save their phone numbers in your contact, because there's not a state dialer like there are national dialers. Save them in your contacts, and like dedicate yourself once or twice a month to calling them and pushing for this bill and others that you see come up on the state level. Um, and just be a voice in your community for the community by saving their numbers and being consistent and engaging with them, and like setting time aside in your calendar during office hours to take 15 minutes to make these calls. And then, so that's IRA, that's a community. Yes, and then there's we also have a community task force in Clifton and Patterson, where we are focused on trying to make where the crux of the Palestinian community is in the state, the best place for Palestinians and Arabs and the community at large to live, uh, so that we don't continue to further our diaspora by moving into suburban areas with better school districts. The idea is to really invest in our own district and continue to create a community that's equitable and safe for us and everyone else. And then we do have assembly races coming up, and as we continue to fight for bills like against IRA and for the Immigrant Trust Act and for the Voting Rights Act, it is very important that we vote in the primaries, because we do have people running for governor that are more aligned to the Palestinian struggle and less aligned both in the Democratic and Republican Party in terms of the primaries. So the goal is for us to push those people in through the primaries that are more aligned to us in the assembly and in the governor's race, because if we get to know who these people are early on in the assembly, then we can either support them throughout their career or stop them from moving on in their career. So that's why the assembly is so important. And at the resource fair on next Wednesday, we are going to be putting out a guide to the primaries and the assembly, because we recognize that not everybody knows what those seats mean, what those jobs are, and what this election is about in this year in New Jersey. So if you're not registered to vote, definitely register to vote. And we do election work when it comes to when it gets closer to the primaries, and would love for people to sign up to volunteer with us as well to help us push those people into power. That's that's all I got. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Halima. All right, thank you guys so much. So again, just oh yes, we didn't put it in here, but I'm gonna send it to you all on WhatsApp, and I think I already did. We are also accepting contributions for Philistine Magazine. Philistine's our literary magazine, and actually part of the Palestine Action Collective. If you're anyone that is interested in literature, whether it's through writing, art, editing, even if it's helping, collect work that you see is important, we are looking for people to build that team. So please, if you want to submit, you can go on our website, pacusa.org/Philistine, and then email Philistine@pacusa.org if you are interested in submitting. But all of this will also be through the collective. So thank you all so much. Oh, Ahmed asked a question. Halima, you could probably answer this one. Philip has recently opposed Ira. From your perspective, is that a genuine opposition, or is he just seeing that that's the trend and Baraka has been opposed to it for some time?
So I actually talked to so from what I know, and in the people that I've connected with in the legislature and through like partnered advocacy work throughout different people throughout the state, it is genuine. Um and that he's actually looking to endorse multiple pro-Palestinian candidates. This is a personal thing. This is not like a no, like PAC doesn't endorse, so I just want to make it very clear that we don't do any endorsements. We're a 501(c)(3). But in answering your question, um, I know that he's from a family that is Zionist, but he himself has been taking he's more of like a two-stater, but is genuine in his support against IRA and his opposition for it, and is definitely more sympathetic. I would definitely say that he's probably second to Baraka in terms of support for Palestinians. But yeah, so on a personal level, like we obviously don't want Mickey Sherrill or Gottenheimer to get into office in the gubernatorial race. That's just my 2 cents as an individual constituent in the state.
Thanks, Halima. And then one last thing, and I will put it in the chat and in our next class, is PAC conference is also coming up. That's going to be the first weekend of April, so April 3rd to 6th. It's a full 4-day weekend. We highly encourage everyone to join, especially as Freedom is the Future participants. We always kind of see the conference as an extension of Freedom is the Future. So we do hope you can all join. And I think that is it for today. So next week is our last class, believe it or not. We will be having 2 guests with us about what now, so actions moving forward. We'll be having Zelly of BLM Patterson and Wasim Kenan of AMP New Jersey. Thank you all for a great class, and we will see you all next week.
Have a good night. Thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you.